5 years of saving. One slap. That's what it came down to. Before I tell you how I turned my brother's life into a living hell, let me know where you're watching from. And subscribe if you believe children deserve protection, even from family. It started with a spreadsheet. One rainy afternoon in the basement of my college dorm. I was 22, single, no prospects. But I'd just finished reading a blog called Weddings on a Dime. And it got under my skin. I named the spreadsheet Wedding Maybe. Not savings, not future, just maybe. That word felt safer. I wasn't one for grand dreams. I liked lines, boxes, predictable numbers. And after growing up in the kind of house where emotions were either avoided or weaponized, structure felt holy to me. My plan was simple. Every dollar I made, I'd save 30 cents, no exceptions, even if it meant skipping lunch or reusing coffee filters. So I got to work. Mornings at the diner on Main. Nights at the grocery store stocking shelves until 2 a.m. Weekends, I cleaned up Excel sheets for a real estate office that paid under the table. 3 jobs. No parties. No roommates. Just me and my metal cookie tin. That tin used to hold ginger snaps. Now it held my tips. Every shift, I'd come home, count the crumpled bills, slide them into marked envelopes, and drop them in the tin. The coins rattled like marbles. Over time, the tin grew heavier. I never told anyone about it. Not my friends. Not even Eli. Not yet. I didn't grow up around applause. We were more of a, don't make a fuss, kind of family. So even when I hit milestones, aced a final, got a raise, learned how to fix a leaking faucet, I kept it to myself. Especially with Brandon around. He had a gift for walking into a room and making the oxygen follow him, not through talent, just volume. By the time I turned 25, I had saved $3,128. It sat quietly in an online bank account under a name no one knew but me. Wedding maybe. The maybe still mattered. Some girls dreamed of cakes and white dresses. I dreamed of control. Of never having to ask. Meanwhile, Brandon had totaled his second car. The first one had been a used Honda our dad paid off in full. The second, a leased Jeep of course, lasted 7 months. He said a deer jumped out of nowhere. Funny there was no report. But Dad didn't ask for one. Mom just sighed. Boys will be boys. They bought him a replacement before the weekend. I watched the whole thing from the stairs. Arms crossed, back pressed to the wallpaper I helped paint the summer before. The same wallpaper Brandon had peeled off years ago after losing a video game. No one had replaced it back then. But when I did, it was suddenly the right shade of ivory. At dinner that night, Brandon joked about manifesting a better engine. Dad chuckled. And then, without irony, said to me, "She doesn't need help. She's got it all figured out." I didn't say a word. I just nodded, then picked at my potatoes. That line, it wasn't a compliment. It was permission to forget me. I carried that moment for years, tucked between receipts and spreadsheets and early mornings. It became part of the reason I worked so hard. Not for approval, but because I knew no one was coming to catch me if I fell. By 27, I had reached $50,000, no inheritance, no windfall, just tips, hours, and receipts. That night, I made tea, sat in the same flannel pajamas I'd had since high school, logged in, and stared at the number. There was no celebration, no champagne, no hug, no one even knew. I didn't mind, but I did allow myself a small indulgence. I opened my cookie tin, still on the top shelf of my closet, and took one envelope out. It was labeled, First Dress Fitting. I ran my thumb across the letters, then put it back. There was still time. Brandon, meanwhile, he was between jobs again. But this time, he said, was different. This time, he was starting something huge. Energy drinks, again. Brandon didn't do silence. So when he got quiet, stopped posting, stopped joking, started working late on something he refused to name, that's when I knew. Another idea. Another plan. He called it Thrust. Said it was the future of functional hydration. You're just mad you didn't think of it first. He laughed, elbowing me during one of our rare sibling dinners. He never noticed that I didn't laugh back. They'd poured $15,000 into it. Mom had lent him the cash from their emergency fund. Dad gave him networking help, which was just code for calling old clients to beg for favors. And me, I sat there with a pasta salad I'd brought from home, watching them plan a launch party for something that didn't even exist. I could have said something, but I didn't. I never asked for a dime, never questioned how Brandon always landed on his feet. Instead, I went home, took off my shoes, pulled out the tin. The envelopes had faded a little. The ink looked softer now. But they were all there. Venue deposit, first apartment, emergency only, dress fitting, and a new one, added just last week. It had no label yet. I hadn't decided what to call it. Maybe Plan B. Maybe Exit. All I knew was the tin was getting heavier, and I was getting tired of holding it alone. Before we move on, if you've ever saved in silence, ever built something no one clapped for, comment 2 if you're ready to hear what happens when quiet women stop being quiet. Let's keep going. I didn't fall in love with Eli on our first date. I fell in love with him when he looked at my budget spreadsheet and said, "This is impressive." He didn't flinch at the color-coded tabs, didn't laugh at the automated rollover formulas, didn't call it intense or too much. He said it like he meant it, like it was art, like I was art. That night, I remember how quiet the apartment was. We had just eaten leftover ramen, again. His socks didn't match, and my hair was in a messy twist I hadn't brushed out in 2 days. We were sitting on the floor, shoulder to shoulder, laptop between us, sipping warm tea out of chipped mugs from Goodwill. And he looked over at my screen, tapped the corner of a tab that read, "Projected grocery spends fall," and whispered, "This is the most romantic thing I've seen all year." I laughed, a little embarrassed, but I think part of me softened in a way it hadn't in a long time. See, most men I dated before Eli thought my spreadsheets were cold, a little too serious, a little too guarded. One guy once asked if I'd ever just relax with money. I didn't call him again. But Eli wanted to know how I calculated the emergency column. Asked me what the yellow highlights meant. Said it reminded him of watching his dad do the family finances at the dining table. A habit that made him feel safe as a kid. He never once made me feel ashamed of how I survived. We weren't flashy. We didn't post anniversaries online or take weekend trips to wine country. But we shared Google Calendars, split bills to the cent, made pancakes on Sundays with frozen berries I bought on sale. And on Wednesday nights, we'd take the trash out and sit on the balcony after, just to listen to the world slow down. Our lives weren't big, but they were honest. One evening in late September, the leaves had just begun to turn. There was a breeze that smelled faintly like cider and cold asphalt. Eli and I went on a walk through the old path behind our apartment building, the one lined with birch trees and broken stone benches no one used anymore. He had both hands in his coat pockets, didn't say much, just walked beside me like we had done 100 times. And then he stopped, turned toward me, and said, gently, "Would you? Not, will you marry me?" Not a kneel, not a ring, not a staged photographer behind the hedges. Just that. Would you? I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't call my mom. What I did do was take a long breath, pull out my phone, and open the app I hadn't touched in over a year. Wedding Maybe. That was still its name. The number at the top read 151-231. It was enough for a small ceremony, a modest dress, a home starter fund, and a bit left over. I looked at L.A. His eyes weren't expectant. They were steady, like he knew I'd say yes, but also like it would have been okay if I hadn't. And I nodded, once, soft, certain. "Yes," I said. That was all. We didn't call anyone. Didn't post about it. We just sat there, amid fallen leaves and quiet air, as if the yes had existed long before the question. A few days later, Eli opened my old Excel file, the one I'd named Budget Wedding, X-Lusks. Back in 2020, he fixed a couple of formula errors, then added a new tab, West List, Dream Fla Realistic. I raised an eyebrow at him. "When did you do this?" While you were asleep on the couch? He smiled. I think I dreamed someone named Aunt Marlene showed up and ate 3 slices of cake. I laughed. A full laugh. The kind I hadn't heard from myself in a while. We spent our weekend evenings planning simple things. Invitations. Themes. The absolutely can't invite list, which turned out to be longer than I expected. I started thinking about home. About the people I should invite, but didn't know if I wanted to. My mom, Denise, called that Wednesday. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, like she was just checking in. Just wanted to hear your voice, Mom said, after a beat too long. But while I have you, I've been a little worried about Brandon. There it was. The pivot. She mentioned he'd had a rough few months, that things hadn't panned out. The energy drink idea, thrust, had fizzled out. Some debt. Some stress. I just thought you should know, she added, like a hook dressed as a favor. Like I could reel myself into guilt if I wasn't careful. I nodded along, phone pressed to my cheek, eyes fixed on the kettle warming on the stove. The hum of the burner felt steadier than her words. Later that night, Eli brought over 2 mugs. Hot tea. No sugar. Just how I liked it. He sat beside me on the couch, his hand brushing mine, not asking anything. Just there. When I told him about the call, he didn't jump to solutions. Didn't say, "You should help," or, "Hay's your brother." He just asked one question, "Do you want to?" And for the first time in a long time, I realized I didn't owe anyone an answer. But I also knew, deep down, what was coming. The next day, I got the text. "Can we talk this weekend? It's about your brother." That was it. No details. No preamble. Just an assumption. That I'd show up, that I'd fix it. That I'd carry what he couldn't. Brandon needed saving. Again. And guess who they expected to play savior? If you've ever been cast in a role you never auditioned for, drop a 4 in the comments. Some of us weren't born strong. We were made strong by everyone else's weakness. The string lights were warm. The flowers were perfect. And then my father took my arm. It was golden hour at the Arboretum. The garden glowed like a watercolor, soft, precise, expensive. We had 70 guests. Mini crab cakes. Lemon spritzers. Hand-lettered signs Eli made himself. I moved through the evening like a hostess should. Small talk. Soft smiles. Hand to the small of Eli's back as we passed friends from college. I didn't see them arrive, but I felt it. A shift in the energy near the fountain. My mother's voice always came first, thin, purposeful. Then the hush that usually followed her. She wore pale lavender, a color she once told me only worked on women who didn't try too hard. My father walked straight toward me, his smile wide, polished, like he was about to raise a glass and toast us. Instead, he asked if we could speak privately. I nodded, set my glass beside a tray of skewers. Denise followed. Brandon trailed behind, hands buried in his pockets, hair like he'd rolled out of someone else's bad idea. We walked to the edge of the reflecting pool. The jazz grew fainter behind us. "Your brother's in trouble," Dad said quietly. That phrase again. So simple. So rehearsed. "He borrowed from the wrong people," Mom added. Her voice stayed sweet, like she was narrating a bedtime documentary. "His business went sideways," Dad said. "His not safe, Lauren." Brandon didn't say a word. I did. "How much?" Dad's mouth twitched. 75. I blinked. 100. He looked away. 1,000. A laugh escaped me. Small, sharp. Not at all ladylike. "You want me to hand over $75,000? I asked. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't flinch. I just needed to hear it said out loud. "You have the money," Mom said. Her voice shifted. No longer soft. Just strategic. "You're good at saving." Brandon still hadn't said anything. His shoes scuffed at the concrete. He looked like he wanted to melt into the begonias. "This isn't about money," I said. "It's about consequences." I turned to leave, but my mother grabbed my wrist. "If something happens to him," she said, "you'll regret this for the rest of your life." I pulled my arm free, not violently, just firmly. "I've been regretting things for a long time," I said. She stared at me like she didn't understand the words. Like I was speaking a dialect she'd never been taught. Then your wedding can wait, she said flatly. But your brother's life might not. That's when my father's smile dropped. His mouth thinned. His hands clenched. And the man who once taught me how to tie my shoes raised his hand. It wasn't loud. But it was clean. A sound that sliced through soft jazz and clinking forks. His palm hit my cheek like punctuation. A full stop. A final line to a story I'd been trying not to read. The champagne glass in my hand slipped. It shattered against the stone. Silence. Then a murmur. The kind that travels fast. Did he just? Was that her dad? Someone should do something. Wait, she's doing it. My cheek stung. But not as much as the realization. This wasn't new. Only now, someone saw. Brandon flinched. Denise's eyes went wide, but not with regret. With panic. I turned. Pulled my phone from the side pocket of my dress. No hesitation. No drama. Just numbers. 911. My voice steady. My name is Lauren McKay. I'm at the Westford Arboretum. There's been an assault. The operator asked a question. I answered. I heard my own voice as if it belonged to someone else, someone I might finally become. Behind me, I saw Monica lower her phone. She had recorded it. All of it. Some part of me. The old version. Wanted to feel shame. To clean up. To smooth things over before the guests started whispering. But the new part. The part I hadn't let speak for 27 years. She stood her ground. And didn't blink. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I let the silence speak for me. And in that silence, I saw who stepped forward. And who stepped away. Before we go on, if this was the moment you would have said, "Nuff. Just comment 3. So I know you're still with me." The moment his palm hit my cheek, everything else faded. The music didn't stop right away. The lights didn't flicker. The champagne didn't spill until I stepped back, and the glass slipped from my fingers. But inside me, something cracked. Quietly. Permanently. Lauren. It was Eli's voice. Steady. Close. A hand on my shoulder, but not gripping. Just there. I reached into my purse, thumbed past a breath mint tin, and pulled out my phone. I didn't hesitate. Didn't ask for anyone's opinion. I dialed. 911. What's your emergency? I spoke clearly, as if reading a grocery list. There was an assault, I said. My father struck me. At an event. I have video evidence. My voice didn't shake. I remember that. I remember it clearly. Behind me, I heard the guests starting to whisper. A few turned their heads. A few didn't. A man in a navy blazer leaned toward his wife. Did he just? I think that's her dad. Someone else said, a little too loud. Monica stepped beside me. I got it, she whispered, holding up her phone. The whole thing. Want me to text it to you? I nodded. And for the first time in my life, I let someone else hold the truth with me. The dispatcher asked for the address. I gave it. Arboretum, East Pavilion. There was a fountain behind me, bubbling like it always did when I came here to think. Except this time, I wasn't here to think. This time, I was here to choose something new. It took 7 minutes. The police cruiser pulled up just as the sun dipped past the trees, casting a long gold line across the gravel. 2 officers stepped out. A woman in her 40s, tight braid, firm eyes. Her name tag read Rayleigh. She looked at me first, not with pity. With precision. You made the call? She asked. I nodded. Come over here with me. She didn't touch me. Didn't guide my arm. Just walked, and I followed. Behind us, I heard my mom say my name. Lauren, honey. I didn't turn. Officer Rayleigh asked what happened. I told her. Monica stood by. She's got the video, I said. Monica held it out. Officer Rayleigh watched for 30 seconds, then tapped her partner on the shoulder. Timestamp it. We'll get statements from each. I looked over my shoulder. Brandon had gone pale. He stood half-shielded behind a decorative ficus, mouth parted. My mom, Denise, was crying. Or pretending to. It was hard to tell anymore. My dad. He stood with his hands in his pockets, chin raised like he was waiting to be applauded. I'll take your father's statement, Rayleigh said, handing the phone back to Monica. Stay right here. She walked over. Deliberate, neutral. But I could see the shift in my dad's stance, the little roll of his shoulder. The "I'll handle this" posture I'd watched him use on clients, coaches, and, for most of my life, me. From where I stood, I couldn't hear every word, but I caught his tone, half chuckle, half disdain. Oh, come on. It was a slap. A family matter. Pause. She's my daughter. Officer Rayleigh didn't flinch, didn't soften. She gestured calmly to the side. Out of the crowd. He didn't move. That's when the edge came in his voice. You don't understand. This isn't about assault. She's being dramatic. We had a disagreement. That's all. Then louder. I wasn't drunk. As if someone had accused him of it. That wasn't a good sign. The other officer was speaking to Denise. She looked small, folded into herself like a guest who'd spilled something on a rented gown. I told him not to come when he's like this, she muttered. That, at least, was honest. Then came Brandon, finally walking forward, hands raised like a peacekeeper. There's been a misunderstanding, he started. Officer Rayleigh turned. Her voice clipped. Sir, you're not under question right now. Please return to the side. He blinked. The authority surprised him. So did the murmurs from the guests behind the buffet table. One of Eli's tech leads, Greg, stood with a glass in hand, watching like it was an episode of Dateline. Then came the words I knew would break it all. Officer Rayleigh stepped back, faced my father. I'm placing you under arrest for misdemeanor assault, she said. You have the right to remain silent. And he snapped. You're kidding me! You're arresting me. For disciplining my daughter. His voice thundered through the arboretum, bouncing off the glass of the reception hall. She's my child. She's been disrespectful for years. He looked at the crowd. At me. And then he said it again. She's my daughter. Really didn't raise her voice. She didn't blink. She's 27, she said. And you hit her in public. Rayleigh's partner reached for the cuffs. My dad jerked his arm back, but only for a second. He realized the optics. Dozens of guests were watching. Still, he didn't go quietly. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, he turned toward me, eyes wild, mouth twisted in something between disbelief and fury. You think this ends with me? He hissed. They'll come after all of us, Lauren. You have no idea who you're messing with. The air around us went thin. It wasn't a father's outburst anymore. It was something else. Rayleigh's gaze flicked toward him. Then back to me. You understand what he means by that? She asked, low. I shook my head, but I filed it away. Like I'd always done. With receipts, with slights, with promises broken. Monica stepped closer, her voice steady. You should let the officers check the venue cams too. This might go deeper than just him. Rayleigh nodded. I already asked the manager. In the background, the string lights blinked on. Soft yellow against the fading blue of the sky. Guests were either whispering or deliberately looking away. A few tried to smooth it over. Clinking glasses, refilling drinks. Some left. Brandon was pacing. Denise was sitting on a stone bench, head in her hands, as if the real tragedy was the spectacle. And me, I just stood there, palm still warm from where he struck me. Eyes dry, jaw steady. Ely reached for my hand. This time, I let him hold it. Before we move forward, let me ask. Have you ever stood up, not just for yourself, but for the little girl you used to be? Drop a 4 in the comments if you've ever drawn the line, and didn't step back. Or just let me know you're still here. Still listening. Still with me. The slap hurt. But the silence after, that's what really stayed. I thought the worst was over. The sting. The stares. The memory of my father's face twisted with anger as the handcuffs clicked shut. But the worst wasn't what happened in front of people. It was what started happening behind closed doors. The first call came the next morning. I was still in pajamas, nursing a warm mug of tea, when an unknown number lit up my phone. Ems McKay. A calm voice. Female. This is Officer Justine Rayleigh. Do you have a moment? I braced. Of course. She got right to the point. We've opened a secondary line of investigation tied to Mr. Richard McKay's financial activity. Preliminary findings suggest a series of failed LLCs, primarily under your brother's name, but cross-referenced with addresses and bank accounts linked to your father. I said nothing. She continued, "There's a concern your identity may have been used, perhaps not explicitly, but as part of a pattern to establish legitimacy with outside parties." Legitimacy. That word hit differently. "I'm not sure what you mean." Officer Rayleigh paused. "Has anyone ever asked to use your name for a loan? A tuition request? A reference?" "No." "Then, not that I remember." Another pause. Then she said something I didn't expect. "People trusted your father because of you, Ms. McKay. You were the daughter who worked." The success story. And just like that, the tea in my hand went cold. About an hour later, I got a call from Aunt Patricia. We hadn't spoken in 2 years. Not for any reason really, just distance, life. But that morning, her voice was tight. Not angry, not confused, tired. "Lauren," she said, "I need to ask you something, and please, don't take it the wrong way." "Okay. Did you ever get the money I sent? Back in 2020, $15,000. My breath caught. She rushed to fill the silence. "Your father told me it was for your grad school. You'd gotten into some Ivy League thing, and he said you were too proud to ask for help, so he was asking for you." "I never applied to grad school," I said quietly. Aunt Patricia let out a long, brittle exhale. "Well, that explains a lot." Then she told me this hadn't been the only time. Over the years, my name had come up again and again. "You know Lauren, she's always so steady. She's got a plan, a vision. She's worth investing in." That was the line he used. I was the brand, the mask, the cover story. The next 24 hours were a blur of notifications, texts, emails, voicemails from cousins I barely knew. "Lauren, I'm so sorry." "Lauren, I had no idea." "Lauren, did you really never see any of it?" And the truth was, no, I didn't. I had always thought my life was parallel. I worked. They drifted. I saved. They spent. But now I saw the pattern. For every loan my father couldn't pay back, he'd point to me. "She's doing great. She just got promoted. We raised her right." For every one of Brandon's implosions, they had a fallback. Me. My good girl image had bought them time, money, credibility, and all this time, I thought I was escaping them by becoming the opposite of them. Turns out, I was the reason they could keep going. By early evening, there was a knock at the door. I knew that rhythm. Too fast, too nervous. It was Brandon. I opened the door just wide enough to see his face. He looked worse than I expected. Eyes puffy. Hands stuffed in hoodie pockets. Mouth twitching like he couldn't decide whether to beg or blame. "Hey," he said, trying for casual. I didn't answer. "I just need 5 minutes. Please." I let him in. He walked to the kitchen like he still lived here, like this was still childhood. He didn't sit. Just stood by the counter, pacing. "I know you're mad," he started. "And you have every right to be." I messed up. I stayed quiet. "But I just need a little help, like 5 grand. Just to buy some time. After that, I swear I'll figure it out." I laughed. It slipped out, soft, but sharp enough to make him flinch. "I'm not your bank, Brandon." He swallowed hard. Then he said it, almost too fast to catch. "Dad said it was fine. That you wouldn't even notice. That you owed us, after everything." "Owed?" I stepped closer. "Owed you what, exactly?" Brandon broke. He sank onto the stool, hands over his face. "I didn't ask questions," he mumbled. "I just did what he said. Signed stuff. Transferred things. Used my name. Used yours sometimes. I thought it was just help." "What did you help him do, Brandon?" He looked up. Eyes red. Voice small. "Launder money." He said it so simply. Like it was a favor. Like we were all just doing what families do. I stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching my brother fall apart not from guilt, but from fear of getting caught. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't just about the slap. Or the money. Or the lies. It was the system. The system where I was the success story, the golden child, the proof that they were good people. The shield, every Christmas card with my name. Every dinner with my GPA mentioned twice. Every time they said, "She turned out so responsible." It wasn't for me. It was for cover. I was their alibi. When Eli came home, he didn't ask questions. He just walked over, wrapped his arms around me, and let me breathe. Later that night, as we sat in silence, I said it out loud for the first time. This wasn't just about a slap, I told him. It was a system, and I was the currency. He didn't speak, just held my hand. And for once, I didn't feel like I had to explain. If you've ever realized your strength was used as someone else's shield, and you only saw it when it broke, drop a 4 in the comments. Or share one word that describes what you carried in silence. I'll read every one. My father missed my wedding. That was the point. He didn't walk me down the aisle. There was no speech. No camera cutting to a teary-eyed dad holding back pride. Just the sound of waves brushing the grass and 30 folding chairs beneath a white arch. It was quiet, deliberate, exactly as we planned. Eli and I had come to Cape Cod on a cloudy Thursday. No big rehearsal, no registry, no color-coded welcome bags. Just a small cottage by the sea, a minister, and the people who truly showed up. We were tired of pretending, of explaining, of apologizing for not doing it the right way. This was our right way. The vows were written in a shared Google Doc. The playlist was a mix of Norah Jones and instrumental versions of songs we once slow danced to in our kitchen. We chose Baby's Breath and Lavender. Not because they meant anything special, but because they were simple, and we could pick them ourselves. I didn't wear white. I wore a soft shade of pale blue. Something borrowed, something bruised, maybe. But whole. Monica fixed my veil before the music started. She didn't say much. Just pressed her forehead to mine and whispered, "You made it here. That's enough." She had been there through all of it. The slap, the police report. The night I called her crying, not because of pain, but because I didn't know what came next. I didn't have bridesmaids. Didn't need a bridal party. But if I had to choose just one person to stand beside me, it would have been Monica. Guests began to gather slowly. Most were people we'd known for years but rarely asked for anything. Neighbors. Old co-workers. Eli's aunt from Vermont who brought homemade biscotti in a tin marked fragile. No one asked about my father. A few glanced at the empty front row seat, but no one dared mention it. And then, right before the ceremony began, my mother approached. Her dress was modest. Hair neatly pinned, she held something small wrapped in tissue paper. "Your grandmother's," she said softly. Then added, as if reading my mind, "She would have wanted you to have it." It was a lace handkerchief, embroidered with blue thread around the edges, frail and floral. I didn't cry. I just nodded, and for the first time in a long while she didn't fill the silence. She just let it be. The music shifted. A soft piano arrangement, the kind that made your chest tighten without knowing why. Eli stood under the arch. Blue tie, brown shoes polished but slightly scuffed near the toe, because he still refused to buy new ones when the old ones did just fine. I walked toward him slowly, not because of nerves, but because I wanted to remember this, all of it. His smile didn't try too hard. It just waited, like someone who'd already made peace with whatever came next. The minister was brief. She talked about storms and roots and how love, at its best, is what remains when the weather changes. No poems, no grand metaphors. Just a truth we'd earned. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't use the vows I wrote. I looked at Eli and said, "This isn't a wedding to forget what happened. It's a wedding to remind me of what I'll never allow again." Some guests looked puzzled. Others nodded, some with tears in their eyes. Because if you know, you know. Eli took my hands. His were warm, steady. "My vow," he said, "is to make sure you never have to fight alone again. Not for your voice, not for your peace, not for your future." I exhaled. Not because I was nervous, but because I finally believed it. After the ceremony, the guests filtered toward the garden hall. Soft clinks of glasses, a light breeze picking at tablecloth edges, and somewhere, Monica's laugh, low and familiar. I stood near the arbor for a moment longer, just watching. Not to soak in attention, but to remember stillness. I'd been through the kind of noise that leaves a scar. Today wasn't loud, it was whole. Eli reached for my hand again, gently brushing his thumb over the back, like he always did when he didn't know what to say, but wanted me to feel safe. "Want cake first or Monica's toast?" he teased. I smiled. "Do I get both?" He grinned. "Always." Inside the reception hall, fairy lights glowed like fireflies overhead. The tables were simple. White runners, jars of baby's breath, a few seashells from the first beach walk we ever took. Denise was seated at a table near the back. She didn't speak much during the ceremony. Didn't stand, didn't cry. But now, as Monica took the mic, I saw her lean forward, just slightly as if bracing. Monica cleared her throat. Not nervous, just respectful. I've known Lauren since she wore department store cardigans and took her coffee black because milk was too expensive. Lauder rippled softly. She's the kind of person who makes spreadsheets to calm down and makes you tea when you're falling apart. I felt Eli squeeze my hand again. She doesn't talk about herself much. Monica continued. But today, I'm going to talk about her. Because it's not every day you see someone fight for dignity, not in courtrooms or headlines, but in the tiny, exhausting moments no one claps for. Budget by budget, boundary by boundary. I saw a few guests nodding. Even Aunt Patricia dabbed at her eyes. "This isn't just a wedding," Monica said. "It's a vow to self-worth. A line drawn in lavender and love. And Eli, thank you for seeing her. Really seeing her." Applause filled the room, honest and round, but Denise didn't clap. She stood, slowly, walked over, in her hand, a square of fabric. She didn't speak for a beat. Then she held it out, a lace handkerchief, yellowing at the edges but beautifully preserved. "This was your grandmother's?" she said quietly. "She embroidered it the summer your father proposed to me. Said every woman should carry something that reminds her who she is." I looked at it. Not taking it yet. Denise's eyes softened. "I'm learning," she added. Not an apology, but not a deflection either. Just a sentence. Just enough. I took the handkerchief and tucked it into my bouquet. We didn't hug. But I didn't look away. After the ceremony, the sun began to dip low, casting golden ribbons across the Cape Cod garden. No champagne towers, no dance floor. Just simple finger foods, a few toasts, and quiet laughter beneath the trees. Monica stepped forward with a glass in her hand, cheeks flushed, hair catching the light. She raised her glass. Not high, not loud. Just enough. Some people get the kind of love that announces itself with fireworks. Lauren got the kind that shows up with dinner, pays the bills on time, and waits in the car while you collect yourself. That's love too, maybe the better kind. She turned to me. "You once said that dignity was your currency. Well, today, you're rich." There were tears, but the good kind. The kind that salt your cheeks and rinse away the old ghosts. Denise stood back by the tree line. She hadn't said much since arriving. But as the guests thinned out, she approached. Carefully. Like someone stepping around broken glass. "I know I can't fix what happened," she said, holding out a small, folded piece of lace. "It was your grandmother's. She kept it in her drawer for years. Said it was for you. I just never gave it. I took it. Not because I forgave her, but because I knew that carrying bitterness would only weigh me down on the path I'd finally chosen." "I'm learning," she said. 3 words. Simple. Unsteady, but more than she'd ever given before. I nodded. No speeches. No second chances. Just a thread of possibility, and sometimes that's enough. Later that night, Eli and I sat on a bench just outside the garden fence. The breeze pulled gently at my veil, and I let it. "I got a message from Officer Reilly," I said. "Oh." She sent a card. Said the laundering probe is expanding. But more importantly, she wished us peace. Eli smiled. "That's more than most people get." I leaned into his shoulder. He smelled like cedar and soap. like home. I used to think the point of saving was to protect myself from everything. I whispered. And now? He asked. Now I know. It was to give myself options, choices, freedom to walk away when things stopped being safe, freedom to build something better, on my own terms. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, softly, still proud of your spreadsheets? I laughed. They got us here, didn't they? We sat there, the two of us, watching the last guest's car disappear down the winding road. I thought about the house I grew up in. The way silence had always lived louder than words. The way loyalty was demanded, even when it was never earned. And I realized something. Saying no to the people who taught me love wrong was the first real yes I'd ever given to myself. No to being the fixer. No to being the fallback. No to being the shield for other people's damage. This was my vow. To build a life where love isn't a transaction. Where quiet doesn't mean invisible. Where boundaries aren't punishments, they're protection. Turns out, walking away from your family may be the most radical way to walk toward your future. And mine had just begun. If this story spoke to something in you, comment 10, so I know you're out there, too, and maybe tell me one thing you're ready to say yes to. Some people think closure comes with big speeches or perfect endings. But for me, it came in the quiet. In the soft wind by the garden arch, in the way Eli held my hand without needing to say a word, and in the moment I chose peace over permission. My father didn't come to the wedding, and maybe that was his final lesson to me. That not everyone you love knows how to love you back. I've learned that family isn't just who shares your name. It's who shows up for you, even when no one's watching. It's who respects your silence, honors your boundaries, and never asks you to shrink so someone else can shine. At the end of the day, dignity is a kind of love, too, and saying no more can sometimes be the most powerful vow you'll ever make. If this story touched something tender in you, I'd love to know where you are in your own journey. Have you ever had to choose yourself over what others expected of you? Feel free to share a memory. Or just leave a comment so I know you're out there, listening. One quiet, strong heart to another.